acronyms and things like that. So I've prefaced that if you have any questions that are easiest to answer along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. Before I get into introductions, I want to acknowledge that I am calling in from Homulchesan of the Squamish Nation. So this is colonially known as Park Royal in West Vancouver. I'm privileged to conduct my work on these lands today. As a public health engineer, I recognize that there is systematic racism within and throughout our institutions, and I have the responsibility and power to create culturally safe and appropriate recommendations on infrastructure. So I definitely encourage you all to do a land acknowledgement on the territory you're calling in from today, either in the chat or just to yourself. So I have mixed ancestry, Northwestern European on my dad's side and Dutch and Tsimshian on my mom's side. My mom's family name is Brooks, and this is the ties to the family that I have in Lax Kw'alaams. So I've just shown where Lax Kw'alaams is on a map for those of you who don't know. It's about 30 kilometers north of Prince Rupert, so you have to get there by a ferry. But I was raised in the Lower Mainland in North Delta, off reserve. My grandfather attended Kokalitsa when his mother passed away, so he was removed from Lax Kw'alaams and sent to the Lower Mainland. And when that closed and turned into an Indian school for tuberculosis, he got sent to Alberni Indian Residential School over on the island. He lived in Nanaimo upon graduation, and my grandparents fostered over 50 residential school survivors while living in Nanaimo. So I have family from nations all over in BC. For this reason, I claim that I was raised in my culture, but outside of my community. My grandfather reclaimed his culture over the course of his life post-residential school, and I was able to learn from him prior to his passing back in 2015. My grandfather passed along most of what happened to him to myself in his final years battling cancer. It has become my responsibility to carry this and share with others, and it is your responsibility to help me carry this and continue it in the work you do as professionals and students and researchers moving forward. So getting into a bit of an introduction, today is a large portion of water and wastewater, but also on decolonizing that. So in order to do that, we have to do a bit of an introduction to the history. So I just kind of wanted to paint a picture of what it looked like to legally be, and I'll use the word Indian because it's in the legal terms, still the Indian Act in the 1800s. So in 1876, the Indian Act came into force. So this was a ban on potlatch gatherings, and parents were obligated to send their kids to schools. So this encouraged enfranchisement. So enfranchisement basically was enticing Indigenous people to move off reserve to lose their Indian status to gain the right to vote, marry, and other rights of citizenship, but at the cost of losing their status. In 1881, Indian agents enforced the pass system, so you were required to present a document to leave and return from reserves, and they had the right to deny that request as well. In 1883, so 2 years after that, residential schools opened, and the last one didn't close until 1996. In 1939, the jurisdiction of Indians was disputed. The federal government and provincial government argued over who had responsibility over mixed identities people. They often had no recourse as no one claimed jurisdiction on them. In 1960, Indigenous people gained the right to vote. This was largely due to their support in World War I and World War II. So you probably are wondering, okay, how is any of this connected to water and wastewater? We're mostly talking about land. Land theft meant essentially losing access to water sources. And water sources are, not just for drinking water. It could also be for transportation. It was also used culturally. And land theft also meant that we were creating more densely populated areas, essentially sending Indigenous people to reserves in essentially what used to be a much larger territory to something much more condensed. There was also an introduction to industrial waste effluent to those water sources in which they could not control. So if they didn't have a right to the land, they had no rights to vote and not a lot of power due to the power of the Indian agents on them. They were kind of at the mercy of whatever was built around the reserve. And several reserves were usually in an ideal location. So either floodplains, away from resources, or actually like displaced. And what I mean by that is that sometimes reserves were not even in the territory where, you know, people like traditionally lived. And sometimes even combined with another nation. So Úxwumixw is a combination of them, of two nations that, you know, the federal government decided that should be one. And then also the opposite, where they separated them, like through the creation of the Canada-US border. So that's like Semiahmoo First Nation, who is actually separated from a lot of their, you know, tribal nations on the south side of the border, essentially through the creation of that border. So that's the connection to land, but how is culture connected to water? And like I haven't even got to the residential school influence on this yet, but there's generations of those who return to a very different home. There's generations of those who did not return home, so never went back to reserve, kind of like my grandpa, and generations who did not have access to the education your grandparents may have access to. So engineers, operators, you know, civil technicians, any of that. So you will see for sure a lack of Indigenous representation in the water and wastewater technical fields. Not because they're not qualified, but because they didn't have access to the same level of education that we did. And there's also generations who are denied access to their culture. So land, culture, and water are so closely intertwined that when you remove one of them, the others suffer. So water on reserve today is either and or inaccessible, high risk due to the industrial activities around it, fed by a source that is not traditional, like groundwater. And I'll preface this by saying groundwater is not a bad thing. It's just traditionally speaking, Indigenous people weren't drilling wells and using that as their source water. Traditionally, a lot of Indigenous populations in BC traveled through the seasons, so used different source water, surface source waters in various seasons. And there's also a lot of kind of situations where the water is non-potable due to health contaminants, whether that's bacteriological or chemical. So I do want to get into a bit of land ownership, and I won't profess that I am, you know, totally understand all the legal repercussions of this. But the government of Canada owns reserve land, and the First Nations hold it in trust. So Aboriginal title gives them interest in the land, but not title to the land. So there, you'll hear people talk about certificate of possessions a lot, or they'll call it CP land, and that's when nations can give individuals, but it still must belong to the nation, the right to occupy land, but not to transfer, sell, or mortgage it. So in those situations, you know, it has to be transferred to other nation members. So reserve land cannot be sold and can only be given to other nation members. And before I get into kind of the stuff that I do at FNHA, it's probably important to do some like terminology introductions. So bear with the doodles. This is me on my iPad to try to make it in a way that will make sense. But the definitions that we use here at FNHA are community water system, CWS, and that's any water system that has more than 5 connections. And then moving below that to the public water system. So it's got 5 connections, but at least one of them is a public building. So you can see, like, I drew, a little school there. So it's less than 5 connections, but it's got the public building there. So it's like 3 houses and a school as an example. And then we have a micro water system at the top right, and that's anything from 2 to 4 connections. And then we have individual water systems where there's that one single connection, the one house there. And why this was important to introduce those prior was kind of getting into the advisories. So yesterday I took a look at all the current advisories going on. And again, I want to preface this is what we know. So on our records, we have 333 community water systems, in which there's 32 current advisories. We have 81 public water systems, which 27 of which are on current advisories. And on micro water systems, we have a total of 134 of them, with 48 current advisories. And with IWSs, we have nearly 1,800 individual water systems that we have on record. And I put 200 plus current advisories because they're somewhere between 200 and 300, but that's just of what we know of. So when I go into community, like for example, I went into one last month where we looked at 22 individual water systems, and we became aware of ones that we weren't aware of before, and we placed several more on advisories. So the 200 to 300 is just what we know of. It's not necessarily a good representative of what the reality is out there. So moving into UNDRIP. Moving into UNDRIP and also the calls to truth and reconciliation. So UNDRIP, for those of you who are unaware, is a document that I have pulled up online, and you can look at yourself. I won't go through it in detail just for time constraints, but it doesn't actually mention water. And I think, and I'll get into this quite a lot in the presentation, but people have a hard time when it doesn't specifically spell out water and wastewater. So water is only specifically mentioned in UNDRIP twice. Like if you're to Control F that document, you only find water twice. But references to Indigenous lands, territories, and resources throughout the UNDRIP are interpreted to include water. And that's similar to a lot of the documents that I'm going to reference, and you'll see that theme come up. But one of the major barriers to the implementation of UNDRIP has been concern over the extent to which free, prior, and informed consent may be interpreted as a potential veto to resource development. Watershed co-governance has been identified as something that could address this issue, and I've had the pleasure of working, on some co-governance structures with nations, the regional districts that have proved to address some of these. So I've kind of gone through the UNDRIP article, and again, like for those of you who have seen some of my other presentations, I might have gone through each one of these directly, but for time's sake, I won't do that today. But as you can see, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, around 13 articles that would be applicable to water through that definition of considering water in the sense of a resource. Very similar in the 94 calls to truth and reconciliation. So just going into the interpretation of that, the 92, so I go into the section of business and reconciliation because when I'm talking to professionals and students who will be professionals one day, this is kind of the section that is most relevant to water and wastewater. So we call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous people and their lands and resources. So you can see I highlighted resources here, and water has legally been defined as a resource. So what this means is that in any project with water or wastewater, You should commit to meaningful consultation, building, there must be a timer on, building respectful relationships and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. Ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. Provide education for management and staff on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations declarations on the right of Indigenous peoples, treaty and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous laws, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So a lot to consider for kind of every project that you're moving forward with water and wastewater. To get into my role a bit, because I think whenever I tell people that I'm a public health engineer, they go, I don't know what that is. And fair enough, there's not a lot of them in the province. And mine varies even between public health engineers that work off reserve at other health authorities. So FNHA EPHS is very broad. So EPHS stands for Environmental Public Health Services. So that can environmental health officers, work with communicable disease control, facilities inspections, solid waste disposal, environmental contaminants, emergency preparedness and response, water, wastewater, health and housing, food and safety. And like I said, I do work with environmental health officers very closely and health technicians. I have one other public health engineer that I get to work with. And then I work with regional managers, program managers, and support staff. I put little stars primarily in the areas that I work with in drinking water and wastewater. Your public health engineers at other health authorities will primarily work with drinking water, where I also have the pleasure of working in the wastewater realm. So some insight into FNHA's history. So in 2011, BC First Nations voted to take control of First Nation health services. Public health services were provided through Health Canada's First Nation and Inuit Health Branch, FNIHB, which had 8 regional offices across Canada. Within the Environmental Health Department, we do not have authority like other health authorities. We have a duty to provide the best and most up-to-date health information and work with the nation's leadership to make recommendations. We have no authority on reserve. We can't enforce anything, so we don't have construction permits or operation permits like other health authorities do. Our department is still inherently colonial. Even though it's been since 2011, we are still working towards and dismantling that every day when we show up at work. I wanted to go through the FNHA 7 directives and keep in mind that FNHA offers several health services, right? Like we have a tuberculosis team, we have nurses in community, there's 1,400 employees here. So these are written very much for the health field. And I've kind of highlighted how, and I'll talk about how this has to be interpreted in the water and wastewater field. So our directive 1 is community driven and nation based, and I've highlighted must be informed and driven by the grassroots level. So when you are, designing water or wastewater systems, this would be something that I'm looking for in projects to ensure that it's been done. So that's, making sure the water operator or the wastewater operator is involved, making sure chief and council is involved, offering to do community engagement, sessions with the environmental health officer, if that's something that would be useful. And our second directive is to increase First Nations decision-making and control. So that looks like, influencing, making sure that First Nations have a seat at the table for design and delivery. Have a table, sorry, just getting some noise in the background there. So making sure that, they have a say in both the design and the delivery. So that looks like, having the water operator have input on the water treatment design, whether that's the distribution, the service connection, and kind of what that looks like in their role. I also talk about prevention a lot. So we want to our role is not to enforce things, but basically to prevent community from getting sick from either their water or their wastewater. And we also want to encourage First Nations to have greater control over their own services. So that, again, looks like making recommendations to ensure that they are providing, if they want to provide water to every single house, that we support them in doing that. And this also looks like federal and provincial decision making. So me and my colleague Dave definitely sit on a lot of calls either with the provincial government or the federal government, and advocate for those water and wastewater services at the highest level. And then I also wanted to highlight this acronym OCAP, which is the Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession. So making sure that First Nations are the owners of their water data or wastewater data and that they have access to it, and being careful about, what we share. So for the purpose of this presentation, I've made some recommendations. I've included some examples of projects, but I've kind of removed any identifying information as respect to the nation. And best practice is always to make sure that you have consent to the nation, and maybe even co-present with them when talking about their water, their wastewater systems. Improved services. So in terms of water and wastewater, that's increasing access, right? Making sure that every First Nation has access to clean drinking water and has access to safe sanitation. Foster meaningful collaboration and partnership. Again, that's collaboration in research and reporting. This one is very relevant to water. So collaborate with other First Nations and non-First Nation organizations and governments to address social and environmental determinants of First Nations health. So poverty, water quality, housing, etc. Develop human and economic capacity. So your projects should always develop current and future health professionals at all levels. So in a water treatment plant or wastewater treatment project, that's encouraging certification for the operators or for the community-based water monitors to have people in community working on their own infrastructure. Leverage additional funding and investment in services from federal and provincial sources for First Nations in BC. And then moving on to our last two directives, be without prejudice to First Nation interests. This one's very general, so I didn't make any highlights relevant to water or wastewater, as well as function at a high operational standard, so transparent reporting, and make best and prudent use of available resources. So if I were to describe what my job is in one image, this is how I would describe it. The water source is down there in the bottom left. And I'm basically, looking to make sure that all risks to that well or that water source are, far enough away that it's not going to affect people's health. So definitely looking at things like, the septic tank, barn, any type of like cattle or horses or anything that could affect the well. So this is just like, when I describe to my parents what I do, this is the image that I use to get them to understand. And like I said, we work with drinking water and wastewater here at FNHA. So kind of getting into that a bit more, I've created this little graphic. We want to do information sharing on infrastructure hazards. So like education and info sharing on what pathogens are, what heavy metals and what other contaminants to their water could be and how it would affect them. We're always involved in discussion on policy. We talk about the options between infrastructure, and I'll show an example of that later. We talk about preventing hazards. So reviewing any new infrastructure that's built on reserves, from water treatment plants to source assessment, storage, or distribution. We work with data or collection systems. So we have community-based water monitors who do the distribution sampling in community and are uploaded to our network where we can review them. And we also resolve hazards, so problem solving for existing infrastructure, where this probably takes up, especially in the summertime, like right now, around 80% of my time, where we're looking into issues with existing water treatment plants distribution, storage, and sources. And similar with wastewater, we do information sharing on O&M best practices, discussion and policy, and preventing hazards. Again, we review new infrastructure, so wastewater treatment plants, collection mains, communal fields and tanks, and complex individual tanks and fields. And we also resolve hazards, so backups, field failures, sewage main breaks, lift station breaks, wastewater treatment plant failures as well. So reviewing new infrastructure, and again, this is for drinking water. We're looking for what's in the source water, any required treatment, so GARP assessments, groundwater at risk of pathogens, or source water protection plans. We're looking at the quantity of water that's needed as well as the quality. For treatment, we're looking at the protection and safety, fire flows, as well as an adequate amount of water in case of emergency, as well as treatment equipment. For storage, we're looking at chlorine contact time, the capacity that it's holding, mixing equipment, and through distribution, we're looking for coverage, making sure that every house is attached, that we can attach to, utility proximity or crossing. So, when we get a new water main proposal, we're making sure that there's not a force main of sewage that's running, above it or crossing it. So basically, kind of the key message that I want to instill on both professionals and students is that the infrastructure choices we make today shape our current and future health. And I say that but in some situations, the infrastructure choices you make will affect Indigenous communities and their health. You might not necessarily live in that community that you're working with. So what does that mean for water? The treatment that you design can prevent waterborne illness. Adequate fire flow and storage will allow communities to fight fires, which everyone knows are occurring more frequently. And treatment can eliminate metals such as lead, which can cause anemia, weakness, kidney and brain damage, or manganese, which can cause lower IQ. So access to clean water improves personal hygiene as well, and byproducts of the treatment system you design can also have adverse effects on health. So kind of recognizing the consequences of poor design in the work that you do and the effect that it kind of can have on community is really important. So a couple examples of what this looks like for FNHA. I've mentioned it before, water source protection plans, involvement in that, installation of a membrane water treatment plant, replacing a slow sand water treatment plant, upgrades to water storage capacity for communities, review of a point of use applications to remove high levels of lead and copper in a school, or a campground is installing a CCAN water treatment plant to chlorinate their water. And I didn't include any pictures of this because this is the reality of I think my job is that it's slow. So I've worked at FNHA for 3 years and I actually couldn't, it was really hard to find pictures to use of something that was already built.
And then more coffee would also be good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, just a reminder to mute your microphones. I think I'm hearing a lot of background conversations. Yeah, so I didn't include any images on this, but I kind of wanted to touch about the funding piece here. So there's, I think, a lot of common misconception. You'll hear people complain about their tax dollars going to First Nations for their infrastructure. And there's a lot to it. It's a lot more complicated than people think. I think a lot of people just tie it down to that, they think their a large portion of their tax dollars is going to water treatment plants on reserve or whatever other social services. But a large part of it is actually from the First Nation monies, which is from Section 61 to 69 of the Indian Act, which outlines its responsibilities for the collection, maintenance, disbursement, and accounting of these monies. And there's two types. There's capital money and revenue monies. So capital money comes from the sale of First Nations surrendered lands, from an interest in the land, or from the sale of First Nations non-renewable resources. So anytime there's anything on reserve for oil and gas revenues, a sale of First Nation lands, a sale of timber, or a sale of gravel, like that's all going into a fund, which is ultimately used for infrastructure and services, as well as revenue monies from like the sale of renewable resources, reserve land activities such as leases, permits, and right-of-ways, fines, and interest earned on capital and revenue monies held by Indigenous Services Canada. So yes, it's true that some of your taxpayer dollars are going towards First Nations capital infrastructure, but there's a lot where you can consider it as their legal requirement, essentially for us to be here, right? There's treaties that were made and understandings, whether those were written or verbal, that basically Indigenous people like allowed settlers to be here under certain agreements and promises of things like education, healthcare. So Canada is actually like upholding its, legal right to Indigenous people through these frameworks. And kind of touching into the funding piece a bit, just so people have an understanding of how projects work on reserve, I've included a little infographic here from ISK about how their projects work. So basically every year there's inspections, there's the e-acres, which is basically, a consultant is sent into a community, goes through all of their infrastructure, writes a report about it. And we also have the annual performance inspections, which are more closely looked on water and wastewater systems. And those go into the FNHA, which is essentially their investment portfolio, where they plan out their next 5 years of upgrades. And then those go into something called like a FAR, DAR, and PAR, so a feasibility phase, the design phase, and then essentially the PAR is like project approval request for construction. So moving into that construction phase. And then you get into operation and maintenance. And it's a cyclical process, right? You don't build a water treatment plant and walk away because, maybe in 30 or 40 years, you might need a new one. And there's guidelines for First Nations waterworks. I won't go through them. They were last updated in 2006. So my job, not so much is to reference those, but to look at both federal and provincial documents and take the most up-to-date recommendations, especially regarding health, and make sure those are upheld on First Nation projects. So yeah, like I said, funding on reserve is really complicated, and I won't promise that I understand it 100%, but I definitely understand it more than I think the average person. So I really just showed this to show how complicated it is. There's so many steps in each part of the FAR, DAR, PAR, and there's also different areas of funding that it comes from. There's A-based funding, B-based funding. So there's a lot of paperwork behind every step of these projects. Moving on to some of the funner aspects of problem solving. In my job, like I said, it takes up 80%. So this is like stuff like, floods, fires that might have that have damaged either the intake or the well or changed the water quality. We're definitely talking about things like requiring additional treatment, or maybe the treatment that's already installed not functioning, or adapting to changing water quality. And in storage, the big things we deal with are like reservoirs running empty from a leak or from an event, or maybe having to superchlorinate a reservoir due to contamination. And distribution, we deal with, flushing, pigging, and depressurization events. So this was the one example that I could find in the 3 years where, something was built while I was here. So this is the one that I think should have been moved up a few slides earlier that I was talking about. But yeah, the existing infrastructure, when we're dealing with these things failing, cause these water quality advisories that I was talking about before, the boil water advisories, the do not consume. And we're always updating, making sure our information is the most up to date based off of Health Canada's recommendations on MACs, which are maximum allowable concentration, or AO's aesthetic objectives. So those are also, why kind of new water quality advisories or boil water advisories or do not consumes are being added, because we're always finding out new research. And I think this is what I talk about when talking about to the students, is that all the research that you guys do will make a difference and is used. I know at sometimes it can seem like it's not, but the research that you guys are doing on water and wastewater is definitely shaping the future and allowing us to make better health decisions based off of the information that you guys discover in your master's or your PhDs. I always joke around that if anyone ever needs a PhD topic, they could definitely come to me, and I have a list of them going. I don't ever want to go back to school, but I have lots of ideas for people who need it. And again, I won't go too into the examples because I've talked about a lot of them already, but a fire recovery recently took up, a large part of my time, because they were taking source water. Their source water was from a creek, and basically there was a forest fire that affected the water quality of the creek. And we basically found that whenever the turbidity was above, 200 NTU, we were actually seeing contaminants head into their water treatment plant. We were fortunate that there was no PFAS or anything from the forest fighting. There's no chemical retardants, but the turbidity basically was causing high levels of naturally finding elements from the rocks, like aluminum, iron, for example, in the water that was clogging up their slow sand water treatment plant. So we basically came up a way with when to turn off the raw water intake based off of the turbidity of the creek to ensure that the water in the distribution system wasn't contaminated. Another project that I'm working on is, working with the community who has brown water. You can see that hydrant in the bottom right, what looks like oil coming out of it, which is actually water. So we're working with the circuit riders, who are basically highly trained water treatment operators who work with Indigenous Services Canada to go in and help on certain things in communities. So we're working really hard on this one right now. And on the left is our EHO, who is taking dissolved metal samples from various locations across the community to understand how the manganese concentration is in various parts of the distribution system. And we're always taking it on the raw water as well as the treated water as well, because in this situation, once you chlorinate it, we're actually precipitating out all the manganese, and that's what's causing that brown water. So that brown manganese is accumulating in the pipes, and whenever there's a disturbance to a pipe, so like closing or opening a valve or any sort of construction, it was causing people to complain about the water and actually lose trust in the water system. Like, I don't know about you guys, but if I turn that on, I wouldn't want to drink that color water. We also do information sharing. So I said before, on different disinfection options, so UV and chlorine, and I'll show an example of that, but also on contaminants, like in the previously mentioned one on manganese, we sent out a community one pager on what manganese is, why their water is brown, etc. And we also share information on legislation, guidelines, and procedures. So this is kind of some of the conversation, and I've used this graphic several times to kind of explain the health risks of using chlorine versus UV. So explaining that chlorine gives us, a residual in the distribution that ensures your water is safe all the way up into the house if designed correctly, versus the UV on the right, which, disinfects at the point, but there is a chance that growth may occur in the distribution. So this is just something handy when I use with community to discuss the options. Essentially, we can't enforce chlorine by any means on reserve, but we can definitely, talk about the options and the pros and cons. And sometimes, the recommendation is to use both, like have the UV for primary disinfection and then a lower dose of chlorine that ensures secondary disinfection. I also am often what I would consider myself the middle ground between so-called experts and community. Definitely having been raised in and around Indigenous people and communities, and then having the opportunity to go to school for chemical engineering, I can definitely see um, kind of the miscommunication that happens between engineers and community. So I definitely would say that a large part of my role is just um, kind of being interpreter, having a foot in both worlds, understanding how a First Nation community works, because I would say most people, in their youth, like haven't been on reserve, where I had many summers on reserve with my family. So it's different. And I think it's a large portion of my job is kind of being like a negotiator between either engineers, the federal government, honestly, probably all three, and community, and making sure that whatever water system is proposed is going to provide safe drinking water for community. I do have a section on wastewater, but given the time, I think I'll leave it. Because I think I was supposed to leave 15 minutes for questions. So I'll address the questions, and then if we have time after, I can definitely kind of get into the wastewater portion.